the customary weapon to destroy freedom. That's how George Washington described violations of the Constitution, usurpations of power. But he was far from alone. The founders and old revolutionaries repeatedly warned us. Every overstep, every excuse, every precedent, no matter how small, sets us on a path to destroy liberty. So on this episode, I'm going to share some of their top and long forgotten warnings about power, precedent, and the dangerous, slippery slope to tyranny. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, January 29th, 2025. Let's kick it off first here with an essential question from John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, 1767, the most widely read documents on American liberty throughout the Revolution up until the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. These were widely read, widely understood, widely accepted principles. Here's the question that Dickinson asked. For who are a free people? Not those, he wrote, over whom government is reasonable and equitably exercised, but those who live under a government so constitutionally checked and controlled that proper provision is made against its being otherwise exercised. So TLDR, if you happen to find people in power to do the right thing with power, that's just luck. It's not really a free society. That's not what describes a free people. And while this was one of the most important principles, I think, of the American Revolution, in one of the most widely read documents of the time, we also see how the same view was brought forward to the Constitution. Here's St. George Tucker and his view of the Constitution of the United States. He had the same message. It is the due restraint and not the moderation of rulers that constitutes a state of liberty. But he continued with this. As the power to oppress, though never exercised, does a state of slavery. So just merely having the power, even if they don't use the power in a bad way, is tyranny. That's how the founding generation looked at things, and I think that's how we should look at things as well. And this is why the founding generation created a bunch of written constitutions during the Revolution and after. In the states, the Articles of Confederation. And here's James Madison in the Virginia Ratifying Convention describing the structure of the Constitution for the United States. He said the powers of the federal government are enumerated. They're spelled out. He said they are few and defined in Federalist 45, and he had a similar take in June of 1788 in Virginia. He said it can only operate in certain cases. It has legislative powers on defined and limited objects, beyond which it cannot extend its jurisdiction. Now, anything that goes beyond those limits is what the founders called usurpations of power. Usurpation is a theft of power, so a usurpation is considered arbitrary power, the very definition of tyranny. James Otis Jr. in 1762 described things like this. He said, arbitrary, which in plain English means no more than do as one pleases. If the people of the several states created a constitution that delegated to the federal government certain things that they wanted the federal government to do as their agent, and the federal government decides they want to do more than that, that's arbitrary power. They're just doing whatever the heck they want. They're not following the rules at all. Arbitrary power was such a big deal to the old revolutionaries that it was included as one of the so-called grievances, the injuries and usurpations, the abuses in the Declaration of Independence. Now, I covered that in much more detail in an episode almost 3 years ago now. Amazing to me. Arbitrary power, how the founders defined tyranny. That'll be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley will get it organized, and I will get it published, the blog post for this episode, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. That'll be published a couple of hours after this live stream is done. Now, the founders widely understood that allowing government to get away with arbitrary power, usurpations of power, violations of the Constitution was a recipe for total disaster. Once you do that, you establish what John Dickinson called the detestable precedent, that they can go beyond the limits. If you give them limits and then you allow them to go beyond those limits, well, then that tells government that they can come up with other reasons to go beyond that limits, and they'll keep doing it over and over and over, and they will never, ever stop. Ever. Here's how Dickinson described things in his broadside against the Stamp Act, urging people to refuse to comply with it, not wait for it to be repealed, because waiting for it to be repealed is the detestable precedent. He said, if you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you fix. You rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. You unnecessarily voluntarily establish the detestable precedent, which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. Everyone understood that once you let it get away with arbitrary power, there's going to be more and more arbitrary power. And as John Adams described it back when he was one of the good guys writing as Novanglis No. 3, the Atlas of Independence in 1775, it's a deadly disease. It'll just, well, here's how he put it. The nature of encroachment upon the American Constitution is such as to grow every day more and more encroaching. Like a cancer, it eats faster and faster every hour. Now, living under the largest government in history, once again, we've seen all kinds of cancers eating away at our Constitution and our liberty from government for generations. Now, unfortunately, though, especially these days, we hear from tons of people, left, right, and center, that all kinds of constitutional violations, we should just ignore that, set that aside for various reasons. The most common ones are, well, they like the program, or they like the person doing it or the team doing it. No, you can't. I like what they're doing in these other areas, so I don't want to attack them on this thing. Or will they tell us, it's just too small? It's not, we've got so many other bigger things to worry about. And I can understand prioritizing our resources, but the suggestion that we should just not even comment on it or defend it because it's a small thing really is more of this detestable precedent. Now let's address that last one first. The smallness of a constitutional violation is actually what Dickinson called the most dangerous one. He considered ignoring it because it's so small a fatal error. He said some persons, I should pull this up on the screen so I'm not staring off into the space there. Some persons, he said, may think this act of no consequence because the duties are so small. He's talking about the Townshend Acts in 1767. He said this is a fatal error. For Dickinson, the small attacks on liberty, the small violations of the Constitution were really the most alarming ones because they obviously are setting something up for later. He said that is the very circumstance most alarming to me, for I am convinced that the authors of this law would never have obtained an act to raise so trifling a sum as it must do, had they not intended by it to establish a precedent for future use. So many people today only think in the immediate term. Their time preference is just wild to me. The founding generation, especially as someone who reads so much from the founders and the old revolutionaries, they constantly thought, well, what will this allow them to get away with in the future? What will this precedent establish? And Dickinson's pointing out that the smallest violations of the Constitution, even the unwritten British Constitution, were the most dangerous because those are the ones that people would generally ignore. And then you have a precedent for them to do much bigger ones on the same legal precedent. He continued, to console ourselves with the smallness of the duties is to walk deliberately into the snare that is set for us. It's a trap. That's not Dickinson, but praising the neatness of the workmanship. But it is a trap. Every time they just put out a little one that they shouldn't do, a little violation of the Constitution, a small attack on your liberty, they're really establishing more of that detestable precedent to build on it in the future. Now, Thomas Jefferson affirmed this same type of a principle, this essential principle of the American Revolution many years later In his opinion rejecting the constitutionality of Alexander Hamilton's National Bank Bill, this is February 15, 1791, he said to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible of any definition. Again, this is you're basically if you say that they can violate the limits of the Constitution, you are saying they can do whatever the hell they want, whenever they want. It's just a matter of political willpower, getting enough people behind them. And this is really the living, breathing Constitution, which is a dead one. It has no restrictions whatsoever. But constitutions don't enforce themselves, so it's really the people voluntarily establishing that detestable precedent. Now back to St. George Tucker, he put it like this. If in a limited government, the public functionaries exceed the limits which the Constitution prescribes to their powers, every such act is an act of usurpation in the government, and as such, treason against the sovereignty of the people, which is thus endeavored to be subverted and transferred to the usurpers. Man, there is so much in that one. They're stealing from you. Usurpation is theft of power from the people. Sovereignty is final authority. If the people have said you could only do these things, and they steal it anyways, how are you supposed to deal with thieves and robbers? Well, that's a different question. Here's how Samuel Adams described these things. He said, the people, this is a letter to Arthur Lee, and I think this is the attitude more of us really need to have today. The people hold the invasion of their rights and liberties the most horrid rebellion, and neglect to defend them against any power whatsoever, the highest treason. So next up, let's address that second kind of claim that people make, why we should just turn a blind eye to something that is, well, I like my guy, and, I like 10 things that he's doing, and I'm not going to complain about these 2 little ones. That's not even that big of a deal anyways. Samuel Adams, as a young man in 1748, put it like this. It is a very great mistake to imagine that the object of loyalty is the authority and interest of one individual man, however dignified by the applause or enriched by the success of popular actions. And he later wrote as well, true loyalty is founded in love and possession of liberty, not individuals. So we have to have that as our goal. Mercy Otis Warren, this isn't an exact same line, but I think it's pretty similar. It shows this kind of person-first, faction-first mentality in her great History of the Revolution, the rise, progress, and termination of the American Revolution. This will also be linked to in the show notes. I encourage you to, it's a free read over at Liberty Fund. You can read it online or download various versions of it. But she said, there is a propensity in mankind to enlist themselves under the authority of names and to adopt the opinions of men of celebrity, more from the fashion of the times than from the convictions of reason. Sounds familiar to me. Thus, with the borrowed language of their chieftain, I love how she writes these things, they impose upon themselves until they think his opinions are their own, and are often wrought up to such a fierce spirit of contention that they appear ready to defend them in all the cruel modes of the savage, who is seldom actuated by motives of candor and forgiveness of injuries. Now let's go to that third excuse that we're always given. And I think this actually covers all 3. We've got this timeless warning from George Washington's farewell address that turning a blind eye to violations of the Constitution, to usurpations of power, to arbitrary power for any reason, it doesn't matter why, is a weapon to destroy freedom. Weapon was George Washington's term. Now first, he reminds us that if we think the limits of the Constitution, well, they're too strict, there's actually a process to deal with that. He said, if, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. I wish I had this one handy in my show notes. Maybe I'll be able to get it to Alan before I'm all wrapped up with everything. But I did an episode just this last fall on what I consider to be the most important veto in history. It was James Madison as president, his last day in office, March of 1817. They sent him an infrastructure spending bill. Now, he had actually advocated in favor of infrastructure spending for a long time. So I think they thought that this was going to be easy peasy. They're going to get him to sign it. And so they went to go visit him, the sponsor of the legislation, with a small group of people. And before they left, he's like, I got to let you know, I'm going to veto this thing because what they sent to his desk did not fit within the lines of the Constitution, even though he was politically in favor of the goal, politically in favor of what they were trying to do. On his last day in office, even at their urging, they said, well, why not just not do anything? Monroe's coming in tomorrow. Maybe we can convince him. But he felt his oath to the Constitution required him to veto it. And he explained it. He explained in his veto message, like, look, I'm not unaware of what we're trying to do here. It's just that what you did in this legislation isn't within the bounds of the Constitution. So I have to withhold my signature until you provide an amendment to the Constitution to authorize the federal government to do this. So anyways, George Washington had this very similar point in his farewell address as well. But wait, there is more. Washington continued with this, but let there be no change by usurpation. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. And he continued, pointing out that the precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield. So, short version is, even if you like what they're doing, you have to reject it. Don't let them usurp power because this is a weapon to destroy freedom, and it will always set a precedent, as all the old revolutionaries understood, for more and more in the future. And you may not like the people who have that precedent in the future. So in short, ignoring attacks on the Constitution, on your liberty, because you like the policy, you like the team, you like the person, you think they're too small, whatever the reason, it doesn't even matter. Any reason under the sun is a weapon that destroys freedom. And I think James Otis Jr. described things best. He said, so long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters. And there is absolutely nothing that helps us reach and teach more people about these essential foundational principles from the ratification debates, from the revolution, and even further back, more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you like the work that we're doing, you want to help support us, and you want to help us continue and expand this effort, you can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options available. Or if you prefer a one-time gift rather than a membership, we'll take that as well. I'm very grateful for any consideration you can give to supporting us. 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. No pressure, but thank you so much for at least considering it today. And there are also a bunch of free and easy peasy things that you can do to help us spread the word, primarily taking actions on the various mainstream video and audio platforms, leaving reviews. These things will help in general trigger algorithms and tell those platforms to show us to more people. Reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, subscribing, getting notifications on all the video platforms, comments, especially in the archives, not beyond the live stream. Also, on YouTube and the video platforms, the more watch time you have, the more likely they'll show us to more people. So all that stuff really helps out a great deal. With that, I really appreciate you being here. I should mention that I'm going to be off on Friday. I have some family things that I got to take care of, but I will be back to my regular schedule this next week. So I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.